We have 1 hour to have the final concluding panel discussion. We have 7 panelists. Shai Feldman regrets he had to leave early this morning, but everyone else is here. And you're in charge. All of you are in charge. You ask the questions. They will answer the questions. So let's go to the first question. Right over here. Yes, on the ground.
Hi. Excuse me. Gene Real from Tenants Harbor. For the entire panel, please. What is the position, policy, and relevance of Russia to the Middle East?
Okay, so I think the ground rules have been, I've talked to most members of the panel, we can't have all the members answer every question. We'll get 2 questions in. So who among you would like to take that question on Russia? Josh, we're all looking at you.
I'll take a little stab. Russia, for Syria, has, I think both China and Russia drew a line at Syria. They thought that Assad might well survive. They'd lost Libya. And if you look at it from China's point of view, 20% of their imported energy comes from Iran. They do not want Iran to fall. They've got big investment there. They see Syria, in a sense, as a domino theory. Both of them see it. They drew the line at Syria, and they thought, let's keep the US and Saudi Arabia from overthrowing Syria and getting rid of a Russian-Iranian influence. But I think that Iran, China, Russia, all of them see that if Syria goes down, all eyes are going to focus on Tehran. And the US policy is really about Tehran. And the reason they want to hurt and overthrow Assad most of all is to hurt Iran, because Iran is the big enemy. And therefore, they're propping up Assad in order to keep the focus from moving to Tehran and regime change from moving to Tehran. Now, of course, Russia has many other interests. They have an interest in having a frontline state on the Arab-Israeli conflict so that they can maneuver on that and squeeze America. They have a big port in Syria, and they have a long relationship with Syrians. They don't want to just throw down, the tubes. And if they get pushed out, they'll have nothing in Syria. So even if Assad can end up on the coast surviving, they will have influence, and they'll be a player, just as Iran will, in Syria amongst the various militias. So rather than join America and destroy Assad, they are hoping to have something left and be a player in the region. Whereas if they abandon him, they will not be a player. So I think that's the Russian calculation, and they're trying to just see if they can end up in the game with a hand in Syria rather than nothing.
This is an important question because, as we talked yesterday, there's a proxy war underway for Syria. You have Iran and Hezbollah and Russia. In a way, China indirectly is supporting the Assad regime, and you have Qatar and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the US and Europe on the other side. So maybe Hussein and also Greg might have a view on this very important question.
I think after the fall of Soviet Union, Russians, they have a feeling of humiliation by Americans worldwide. And they want to regain their power and position and the strength. For them, now is the time, because the US has failed in Iraq. The US has failed in Afghanistan. The US strategically is going to divert from Middle East to East Asia. They know that the US is going to be independent on oil. The US is not going to invest its capital because of Persian Gulf or Middle East oil like before. I mean, there would be changes. I think they have a grand strategy to fill the vacuum. And of course, they cannot start from Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is still ally of the US. And Iran is a good partner to start with. China is different. I think Chinese, they are extremely clever. And yesterday, there was a question about what United States can do in the Middle East. I would propose United States follow the Chinese strategy. Just they are concentrated on economy, and they stay away of military actions, strikes, political challenges. Is very important, Nick. In 1990s, when I was ambassador in Germany, the share of Europe in Iranian economy and trade was about 60%. Today is 18%. China is 55%. I think this is the policy the US should concentrate. And I believe Russians, they have more political initiative rather than economic for the Middle East.
Thank you. Greg.
I think of Russia as an energy exporting state. And I think in the longer term, if all the talk about an energy revolution is true, and we see downward pressure on energy prices over the next decade, I think that it places Russia actually in conflict with a number of the energy exporters of the region. Right now, energy prices are such that everybody can get a good return. But if we actually see energy prices go down, there's going to be a lot of toing and froing among energy producers, both within OPEC and outside OPEC, for market share. And I think that that might be the dynamic that we'll be talking about down the line.
Thanks to all three. Question in the balcony.
Hi, my name is Bowden Syed, and I'm here with the University of Maine. My question was, can we or should we utilize the diverse American Muslim society in helping in this difficult democratic transition? After all, they live in a democratic society, have seen its benefits, and can better relate to the people.
Well, Barbara, Mark, Marwan all know a lot about this topic. I'll leave it to the three of you, or all of you.
That's a great question. I've been thinking about the diasporas in the United States and in Europe. Certainly they played a huge role in Libya, because after the Gaddafi regime fell, there was no one there with any experience in any aspect of civil society or self-governance, even some areas of commerce and development. And so the diaspora has been incredibly important there. But I think your question is more about how Muslims in the United States might be a bridge. And I think it's a great idea. I think it needs a lot of thought. My sense is that there's a lot of work to do still here inside the United States in reaching out to the Muslim citizens who are here, and that maybe this would be a great way to launch a dialogue about how it can be done. And I just think it's a great idea.
Mark.
So I think it's a fantastic question. And actually, I've been very frustrated with the way that much of the so-called war of ideas was waged over the last decade, because implicit in it, there was this juxtaposition between the United States, portrayed as liberal and secular, and then a Muslim world, which is consumed with religion. And my experience of America is that we're a deeply religious country. And the genius of America is that it was able to reconcile strong religion with a constitution which allowed the separation of church and state. Doesn't mean that there's no church. The church is strong, and that's a wonderful thing. And I think that the crafting of the message of dialogue between the United States and the Muslims of the world should recognize that and not try and make us look like something that we aren't. And I think that was a huge missed opportunity in those early days when we could only think about combating radicalism and Islam as the source of radicalism. I think that was a wrong turn in the way we thought about the question.
Marwan, do you have a thought here?
Well, only to add to what has been said, that Islam in this country, particularly political Islam, is seen as monolithic by most people. Most people just lump Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Muslim Brotherhood, Salafis all into one group, and they're not. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood, which won the elections in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, might have views that we disagree with, but they've been peaceful for decades, and they represent the overwhelming majority of political Islam. Al-Qaeda and Salafis are, well, Salafis is a new phenomenon, really, in terms of their political activity. Al-Qaeda is still on the decline, I think. Syria might have revived some of their activities, but they are on the decline and are a very vocal, very small minority. Hamas and Hezbollah came about because of their sort of operation in theaters related to the occupation of their countries, Lebanon and Palestine. But the overwhelming majority of political Islam belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots in the various Arab countries, and they are peaceful. I personally disagree with a lot of their activities, but I think that one has to bear this in mind when the U.S. devises its policies towards the region, that political Islam is simply not a monolithic group.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from one of our other locations. And it is from Barbara Moran in Rockland. Ambassador Mousavian, how are international sanctions affecting the people of Iran, food, medicine, constructions, trade?
One word, greatly. It has a really great impact on the normal life of ordinary people. Food, medicine, the basic foods, because of the financial sanctions, the banks, they cannot transfer any money. That's why even the government, they cannot import the basic commodities for the people. And it's really harmful. We have the evidence of sanctions against Iraq, which about 1 million people ultimately after a decade they were killed or they lost their life because of the impact of the sanctions. I hope this would be something the P5+1, the world powers, they would consider, not to harming the ordinary people, the civilian and the Iranian nation on the disputes over the nuclear.
And since I've been involved in the sanctions issue, maybe I'll just comment. And last evening after the session, I met with a lot of the students from the College of the Atlantic. They're seated up in the first row of the balcony here. And one young man who is here today, and I apologize I didn't get your name, asked, is there an ethical dilemma, if I can paraphrase your question, for the United States in sponsoring sanctions? I mean, don't we have ethical responsibility not to hurt people? And it's a very challenging question that all of us who've been in government have struggled with. And maybe Larry would like to comment upon this as well. I negotiated 3 of the UN Security Council sanctions resolutions for the US on Iran, as Hussein knows very well. Our calculation, this was George W. Bush, but Barack Obama has an identical view. In fact, he's taken the sanctions to a much further degree, was that our first priority is to negotiate with Iran, as we discussed last night. In the absence of those negotiations, what are our options? Well, war is one, or the use of military force. Sanctions is a separate one, because the sanctions are designed to convince the Iranian government that they're better off negotiating with us. I see sanctions as part of a diplomatic strategy. I will tell you, there is a trade-off. There's no question that innocent people are being hurt by them, but the government's being hurt by them as well, of Iran. And so that's the calculation that both the last 2 American presidents have made. And I thank you for asking the challenging question that you did. Larry, you may want to add to this.
I would just add the sanctions are a blunt instrument, and we sometimes sort of characterize them as they are an action short of war, but they do damage people. We saw this in Iraq, and it was something that we struggled with. When you are trying to influence the actions of a foreign state, you have a limited toolbox, and sanctions are part of that toolbox, and they're being used in the Iranian case.
Yeah. Mark, yes.
I spent a lot of time working on the sanctions issue during the long struggle with Iraq, and I think the ethical issues there were profound. And I think that one of the reasons that many of us were extremely critical of the sanctions on Iraq was that they seemed to be divorced from any strategic outcome. And I think that when you talk about the ethics of it, I think you have to add in the practical question of, do they work? Mm-hmm. And I think that the evidence overwhelmingly is the answer is no, that they almost never compel change of regime or significant changes in regime behavior. And I think that, Nick, you're right, that this is one, and Larry, I mean, this is one of the few tools in the toolbox other than war, and so we always use it. But it strikes me as a classic option C, a way to do something, but it almost never achieves the desired effect. And I think it is worth rethinking that.
Hussein.
Just to mention, in 2011, 2012, two American congressmen, they were asked about the sanctions, whether you are penalizing Iranian nation or the government, while the sanction is more on the nation. And they very clearly said, unfortunately, I mean, publicly they said, yes, this is our target. We want to punish Iranian nation to bring regime change. This had a very, very negative effect in Iranian public opinion.
And not that Hussein and I probably want to reprise our conversation from yesterday afternoon. And I'm not just trying to get the last word, I'll give you the last word. There's been a lot of academic research on sanctions, and I think Mark is exactly right. It's hard to find an example where it's worked well. Some people would argue that South Africa, the sanctions against the apartheid regime in the 1980s that unfortunately and shamefully the United States joined last, that they did have a big impact on the thinking of the Afrikaners, that they had to negotiate with Mandela for a multiracial South Africa. In the case of Iran, I guess I'd say what the Bush administration did was work with Russia, China, Europe on the Security Council sanctions. The Obama administration is focused on financial sanctions, on taking away Iran's capacity to trade in oil and gas or to diminish it. And I think the jury's probably out on the impact of those sanctions. We may actually see the answer, but I'll give you the last word on this. We may see the answer in the next few months. I know that President Obama fervently wishes to negotiate, and he's hoping that the sanctions will convince Iran to do that.
I think, Nick, in 2003, 2005, when the file was not referred to United Nations Security Council, there was no sanctions. And I'm sure, Nick, you are very well informed that we told Europeans that we are ready for the maximum level of transparency, to cooperate with the IAEA, to implement additional protocol, to cap our enrichment at 5%, to do everything to assure Iran would never divert its nuclear program toward weapon. Just we were asking for our initial rights under NPT. That's it. I mean, this was the time without sanctions. And if tomorrow Iranians, they tell you the same wording, you should not consider this is because of the sanctions.
Okay. I'm sure we'll revisit this, either here in Camden or some other conference. We have a question here on the floor.
Hi, Ann Perkins from Thomaston. Because I'm particularly interested in energy issues, and I'm not quite the fan of technology that others might be in technological advances, the elephant for me in the room the whole time is the issue of oil. And in a broad sense, and in a particular sense, and we've only referred to it obliquely or in reference to other issues except for the answers to the first question. And for me, I know that all of the states that we've been talking about aren't oil-rich, but many of the oil-rich states do provide aid to those that are less fortunate in their reserves. How are these economies and these countries going to respond to depletion of their oil reserves? And in the case of these proposed technological advances that everyone would like to see on the horizon, the resulting their revenues going away. And we're talking, the question is, why would Iran need nuclear power? Because if they are not going to have any more oil, and this is a question that we're facing, how are these economies going to deal with these depleted resources and making sure that their populations, which are growing, are going to have the things that they've come to expect?
Good question. We had talked about this yesterday. I encourage you to ask that question, so thank you. Marwan and maybe Greg on this question, or anyone else, just let me know.
Well, oil has been certainly both a blessing but also a curse in Arab societies, in rich and, in oil-producing and oil-consuming countries alike. In oil-producing countries, oil has basically killed productivity on the economic level because people don't have to work if they can, find money on the ground, literally. And it has produced welfare state economically and repressive states politically. No taxation, no representation. These people, don't pay taxes, therefore they shouldn't be expected to be represented. In oil-consuming countries, my country is included, it has created these rentier states, this patronage system where oil, Arab aid coming from these countries, either directly in the form of grants or indirectly in the form of remittances from workers working in these countries, has also allowed the state to spend beyond its resources and to spend its money also not on productive activities all the time, but on creating layers around it that are basically, paid with favors in return for their loyalty. And I think we are coming to a stage where this is no longer working. The ability of the state to exercise this largesse in terms of its population is coming to an end. In a country like Jordan, the ratio of the workforce that is either employed by the state or paid by the state as retirees is over 40% of the workforce. The ability of the public sector to continue to do that, has reached its limit. And unless the country takes not just different economic decisions, but also a political will to get rid of the rentier system over time and move to a more productive system, countries like Jordan will continue to have severe problems economically and politically as well. The same is true in rich countries also. Saudi Arabia is a welfare state, but it has some real problems, as Robin and others alluded to yesterday. Unemployment among the youth is very high. Inequity, 60,000 members of the royal family, all with generous stipends from the state. This cannot go on forever, even if oil stays in a place like Saudi Arabia for quite some time.
Greg?
It can't go on forever, but it can go on for a while. And I don't really think politicians anywhere take long-term views of things. I think they tend to think what's going to get me through today, tomorrow, next year, next election, whatever. I don't think the issue is depletion. There's actually plenty of oil in the region, and with technological changes, they're finding more. Not just here in the United States, where we're having a mini energy boom, but everywhere. The question is population, and there are two kinds of oil states: highly populated and low population. The low population ones, like a Kuwait or a Qatar, they have absolutely no reason to change ever. Except when we, finally invent the car that runs on water or air or trash, like in Back to the Future, then we won't care what those people do, okay? And they'll just have to work it out themselves. A very well-educated Omani who worked for their oil company and had a doctorate from Cambridge. I was talking to him once, and someone at the table said, "Well, what's going to happen when you run out of oil?" In his very plummy British accent, he goes, "Well, I assume we'll all become fishermen again."
Pearl divers.
For high population countries like Iran or Algeria, where per capita energy resources are relatively low, these are really serious, immediate issues. A country like Saudi Arabia is somewhere in between there. The biggest problem in Saudi Arabia is not depletion, it's domestic consumption. The Saudis are burning more and more of their oil to run their own air conditioners, right? They have among the lowest prices of energy in the world, and thus consumption is encouraged, not managed. And if you just draw straight line extrapolations, the Saudis will not have any oil to export in 30 years because they'll be consuming it all. That's the real challenge for an energy exporter like Saudi Arabia.
And Iran?
I think it has two different impact on different nations. Nations which they are real nation, like Turkey, like Egypt, like Iran, with history, civilization, they have deep roots, and the impact on such nations would be different. With those nations which they are young, I'm not old, but some of the countries in the region, they are younger than me, with artificial borders and no democracy, no roots. They are different. I don't want to name any country. But just look after Iranian Revolution, Iran was importing, Nick, almost everything from the West, everything, before revolution. We didn't have industry at all. It was assembly just. Cars, everything. Even on military side, we were not able to produce bullet before revolution. After revolution, due to sanctions and pressures, Iran had to go to self-sufficiency. Today, on conventional arms, Iran is independent. They produce airplanes, tanks, missiles, everything. They are one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East, independent on producing conventional arms, thanks to sanctions. Otherwise, Iran could even not produce one bullet. This is about the same about industry. I mean, they are producing cars, industry, everything. On sophisticated technology, not only nuclear, nanotechnology, Iran is between top 10 on nanotechnology. And Iran has now one problem left. Iranian budget, Nick, is very much dependent on oil income, very much. And there is a very powerful school of thought today in Iran saying this is now a golden opportunity for Iran. Let them sanction the oil. Then we build a new economic system, a new budget, free of depending to oil. Then Iran would be completely secured, safe for the future. If it goes to that point that they sanction Iranian oil, definitely Iranians would have very, very difficult situation for a decade. But after a decade, like I said, the decade after war, Iran had everything. Then I believe it may be counterproductive for the West because Iran would be able to manage economy without oil.
Thank you. We have a question on the balcony and then one here. Balcony first.
Hi, my name is Maya. I'm from Mali, and I am an MBA student at University of Maine. I have a question about the northern neighbors, Europe, and the financial crisis. As you mentioned, the next decade there's going to be a lot of turbulence. I'm wondering what will be the economic impact on Europe.
I am happy to say a word about this, but I don't want to take away from any of the... Josh, you want to start?
Migration, I think, is one of the biggest impacts. Some years before, during the Bush administration, the German ambassador in Damascus said to me, when Bush was squeezing Syria, he said, Germany's greatest fear is that Bush will succeed because we're already inundated with Muslim immigrants, and the Iraqis are now coming in. If Syria explodes, there's going to be hundreds and thousands more immigrants, and they're going to want to get to Europe. And I think that is one of the major anxieties of the European states, is that the failure of Arab states around all of those Arabs are trying to get to Europe. Now, they may not be able to. In talking to Syrians, almost every Syrian I know is applying like mad for passports to all the European countries. The pressure, now they won't get them because nobody's giving Syrians passports anymore, but they're going to find a way through Turkey to get into Europe. And that's the greatest fear, I think, for the Europeans of what's going on in the Middle East today. And it's driven by sanctions to a large extent. Sanctions is going to add to that because America is contributing to the impoverishment of many countries through sanctions. And in some ways, it's a very un-American thing to do because our basic philosophy has been to support middle class and that through getting wealthier, that people will become democratic and they will make something of themselves and they will change regimes like Iran's regime or Syria's regime and other bad regimes that through their development, they will overcome that. But by impoverishing them and locking them in sanctions for years, as has happened in Syria or Gaza or Sudan or Libya, Iraq, where 1/3 people died because of sanctions, according to the UN reports, that this really moves the situation in a backwards trajectory. If it doesn't have the immediate effect of overthrowing the regime, it really takes the whole region backwards, and it will put a lot of pressure on Europe, I think.
Marwan.
I agree with Josh, not just about Syria, but the whole, or a big part of why the Europeans started what was called the Barcelona process in the mid-90s is to stop immigration from North Africa into Europe. And the question for them was, if we are able to push these countries to have economic and political reform, then their people will stay where they are and they would not immigrate to Europe in large numbers. That policy basically did not succeed, because while the Europeans did pour some money into the countries of the Middle East, they were not able to successfully convince these countries to do either of political and economic reforms. And the conditions that were placed on getting this money were really extremely mild, particularly in the political reform arena. By the time the Europeans started feeling that their policy was not succeeding with the Barcelona process, the Arab uprisings came about. And they, of course, forced them to start thinking anew on how to even further stop these immigration tendencies at a time when Europe itself is facing a severe economic crisis, with Greece, with Portugal, with a lot of other countries that might be coming. Europe is in no position today to pour in more money into the region than what they have been doing already. They simply do not have it. And so the Europeans are basically, in a state of they don't know what to do about the Middle East. And I'm not sure there are simple answers to that.
Barbara.
One of the proposals I've been hearing from the Italians in particular would be to reach out to especially the North African countries experiencing transition with some free trade agreements, things that don't cost them a lot, like aid, but would recognize the fact that, Egypt's 12-month agricultural cycle means that they could supply European tables without taking a lot away from European agriculture. Whether they'll have the will and the ability to focus on that when they have so many of their own problems is the question.
Right.
May I have a follow-up on the free trade agreements are very important.
Please.
And
I yield to Mr. Ambassador.
I'm sorry. I didn't see you. No. Go ahead.
No, please.
Go ahead.
Mark,
you're far smarter than me. Go for it.
the right honorable Marwan Marasher has the floor.
I agree with Barbara. All I wanted to say is, a country like Jordan did sign a free trade agreement with the Europeans, and other countries have as well. But in the past, the Europeans would allow you to export products you did not produce, and did not allow you to export products you did produce.
Yeah, exactly.
and that of course does not work. Most. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
the Europeans have not yet, in my view, indicated that they are seriously revisiting this so that the free trade agreements they sign are going to be meaningful.
Mark.
No,
This better be good.
I agree with everything Marwan said. No, all I was going to say is that I was in a meeting not too long ago with a group of Tunisian economists and development professionals and World Bank and IMF officials, and they were kind of brainstorming on how you can best help. And one of the main complaints that I heard again and again from the Tunisian side was, you keep talking about aid, and yes, we do need aid, our finances need assistance, but what we really need are open markets, let our labor migrate more freely, and invest, and foreign direct investment. And their complaints repeatedly were that the emphasis is overwhelmingly on the aid side, because that's something which can be done by European countries. Even if they don't have much money, it's easier to do, as opposed to the much more politically difficult but much more useful investment, opening markets, and allowing labor migration. And I think that's part of the mismatch that you're describing.
Yeah. Your question has elicited the entire panel's attention. I would just say, as a follow-up, the Obama administration has famously pivoted towards Asia, but you may see a repivot towards Europe, because the administration is very concerned about a weak Europe. Mm-hmm. Europe's our largest trade partner, it's our largest investor, our largest collection of allies. And so President Obama in the State of the Union proposed a new free trade agreement between Europe and the United States, the two largest economies of the world, that a lot of economists think could boost productivity in both places. Well, now, how does that relate to the Middle East? Europe still has ties. Italy, Spain, France, Greece, to Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, Egypt. The two-way trade's important, the investment's important. We have a very weak Europe. It's, I think, in the interest of the Arabs, the Iranians, and the Americans to see Europe revive itself. So it's a great question that you asked. Yes, down here, and then in the back. Yes, right here. Yes, two, sorry.
Larry Litchfield from Belfast. I have a question for Ambassador Pope. Sir, you referred to a State Department study which you said contained two pernicious ideas, one of which was the idea that, as I understood it, the authority of national states is losing ground.
Yes.
And I guess I wanted you to elaborate more on that, because it seems to me that with the power of ethnic groups and religious sects and ideological movements, not to mention multinational corporations, that you could make a pretty good argument for the idea that national states are losing their authority.
Yes. That's a great question. And there is no doubt whatsoever, if you look around the world, that globalization is a fact. The information revolution has transformed our lives. It has changed everything. One thing it has not changed, however, is that the world is still composed of a fabric of sovereign states. There is a fashionable idea which is associated with a person who teaches at Princeton and was formerly at the State Department. Her name is Anne-Marie Slaughter. And the notion was that America had an edge because America was good at networking. This was a famous foreign affairs article, and she was hired to conduct that study, which by Hillary Clinton as the policy planning director of the State Department. The notion that America had an edge because America was good at networking, right? Was sort of the notion, and everybody else's. The problem with that is that the idea then becomes everybody else's sovereignty is permeable and negotiable. But no theorist would suggest that American sovereignty is being adversely affected by globalization and the information revolution in the same way. That's the first point. The second point is that this was a study that was intended to reform the American foreign ministry, right, and get it to think more differently about the world. Well, a foreign ministry is only one aspect of a state and a people's relationship with the outside world, but it's an important one, and it relies on managing relations between sovereign states. The problem we've had, I think, is that we've forgotten that the essence of diplomacy, that loaded word, isn't somehow controlling the outside world with sort of various means. It's negotiation. It's negotiation, and in order to negotiate, you first have to recognize the reality and the legitimacy of the other. And so when that idea is eroded, it's pernicious when you think about the mission of a foreign ministry. That was the point that I was making, not the point that there isn't a broader globalization which is real and which is affecting our lives. And in Libya we had I mentioned that Facebook page, and I look at the Twitter feed every day from Tripoli, and these are powerful instruments. They're sometimes a bit double-edged when they're used by representatives of states. So that was what I was trying to suggest.
I know we have a lot of people who want to ask questions. We'll try to get everybody in. I think we're going to go first, Jim, to one of the other locations. This is from Maggie Samuels in Belfast. Gregory Goss, do you think if Turkey wants to increase their influence in the Middle East as an alternative to Egyptian power, that they should go all in Syria? Would the Turkish citizens allow the government to make that commitment? So in other words, Greg, if the United States is not going to put troops in the ground or even get interested in organizing others, who's going to lead? Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar?
Not Qatar. I think that the Turks are incredibly reluctant, as I said yesterday, to put boots in the ground in Syria because they appreciate the downsides of this. They appreciate the fact that they could get caught in a situation where actually military power might not be all that helpful, and they're stuck the way we were stuck in Iraq. It seems to me that the Turks were riding high at the beginning of the Arab awakening because they had a model. Right? They had a model of a moderate, Islamist, elected, democratic government with a booming economy tied to the West. And that this was a very powerful model. And Erdogan kind of took a victory lap at the end of 2011 through North Africa, basically saying, of course you have to develop your own systems, just like we say all the time. But, you know, you can learn from us. And he actually pushed the notion of secularism, despite the fact that it is an Islamist government, an Islamist party, as one of the elements of developing your political system. It was all very, very interesting. It was soft power, quote unquote, at its height. But the issue of Syria is one where hard power is going to be more important than soft power, at least in the coming months and maybe years. And there the Turks are extremely reluctant to commit their military forces, and I think with good reason. And thus, it seems to me that I don't think we're going to see a Turkish escalation into Syria unless things start happening on the border where the Syrians move to provoke.
Hussein.
When Erdogan came to power, his foreign policy strategy was labeled as zero tension with the neighbors. And today he has tension with all the neighbors. He has already failed in his foreign policy. And I believe now they understand they made a mistake. They went too fast at the beginning of Syrian crisis. There was a belief in the US, in the West, in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, that Assad would be finished within 2 months. And this is 2 years, Assad is there. Turkey would have more challenges in the future because they have a big population of Alawites within Turkey. Alawites, of course, they are behind Assad in Syria. And the Alawites in Turkey, they have sympathy. Turkey has a big population of Kurds. Majority of the Kurds living in Syria, they are supporting Assad. And this impacts the Kurds within Turkey. And I believe as Erdogan has understood that he has to modify his position towards Syria.
I would just add that Turkey is such a fascinating country. It's so dynamic, growing economy. And as power shifts, I think it's true, I don't know if people would disagree, that Turkey is more influential in the Middle East than Britain or France or Germany. And I wouldn't have said that 10 or 20 years ago. And Hussein is right. The Turks have probably reached too fast for this power, but it's there. It's a very dynamic country. I would buy stock in it if they sold it. Marwan.
They do. You can invest in the Turkish stock market.
I meant in their foreign policy. Anyway.
I want to comment on this Turkish model because it is a model that the Turks themselves are pushing more than the Arabs are basically embracing. And it's a model that the Turks convinced themselves that the Arab world is ready for because Mr. Erdogan is a very popular person in the Arab world. But we need to remind ourselves that he's not popular because of the Turkish model of governance. He's popular because of his rhetoric against Israel. There's a big, a difference of why he was popular, in the same way that Mr. Ahmadinejad today is very unpopular in the Arab world because of his position on Syria after a period of time in which he was extremely popular. So when we talk about the Turkish model, we have to parse it. What does a Turkish model mean? If it means secularism, it's not going to resonate among many of the emerging countries in the Arab world. If it means economic independence and power, there's something to be looked at there. If it means separation of church and state, or a military as the arbiter of and defender of democracy, again, it's not going to resonate. So I think the Turks have tried to push their version of a Turkish model and are starting maybe to discover today that this is easier, said than done.
Thank you. A question up here, in the balcony.
Hi. Yusuf Al-Matrouk, originally from Kuwait. I attend the University of Maine. My question is for you, the mediator. Yesterday, you referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist groups, which would mean that they are similar to that of Al-Qaeda. To me, as an Arab citizen, I find that to be a little absurd. Could you give me your definition of terrorism so that it would better my understanding of your point of view?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. The indiscriminate use of violence to achieve a political purpose would be one attempt at a definition. But what I said yesterday, in response to another question, was that I'm an American, and I'm a particular American. I served in our government. And I look at the history of our government's involvement in the Middle East over the last 20 to 25 years, and I see, particularly from Hezbollah, repeated attacks, assassinations of American citizens, repeated attacks on the United States military, including our Marine barracks in Beirut, our embassy in Beirut. I mentioned Malcolm Kerr. We're friends with his family, assassinated by a combination, one believes, of Hezbollah and Iran in January 1984. I look at that as terrorism. Yeah, I do.
Nick. Yesterday, also Nick raised this question to me 3 times. I did not reply. It is true the United States consider Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist group, but overwhelming majority of countries worldwide, they do not. Iran does not. 57 of Muslim countries, they do not consider Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist group. Even the US allies like Saudi Arabia. The main source of finance and weaponry for Hamas is the US allies in the region, the Arab countries. It is not Iran. They know very well, the intelligence services of the West, they know the main money is coming for Hamas from the Arab countries, not from Iran. Although Iran is blamed, but everyone knows 90% of Hamas resources, money, weapon, everything is coming from Arab countries. 120 countries, member of allied movement, they are not considering Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist country. I don't know, this is only maybe US and Canada, Nick, correct me, even Europeans, they do not consider. That's why even the vote, Nick, on Palestinian issue just in September, you noticed the US and Israel, they were extremely isolated worldwide. 187 countries, they voted for Palestinian state. The US and Israel, and 2-3 tiny islands, they were with the US. It is really different, Nick, in the region. I mean, as he said, they look at, if you consider Hezbollah as terrorist group, Hezbollah is part of parliament, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah is part of government, they have ministers, therefore you should consider Lebanese government as terrorist government. Why you have relation with them? Why you have ambassadors there? If terrorist group is member of parliament, is member of cabinet, why you have relation with them? The perspective in the Middle East is completely different. I mean, they really, Middle Eastern people, the Muslim countries, they love Hamas, they love Hezbollah because they are fighting for integrity of Lebanon. That's why all Lebanese, they support Hezbollah. And Hamas also is fighting for Palestinians.
We're probably not going to convince each other, Hussein.
Yes, of course.
I'm pretty sure about that.
Thank you.
You have your national perspective, I have mine, but I just answered the young man's good question. You know, I have got to judge Hezbollah, and your government created it in the wake of it did, and you would say that, I think, in the wake of the Israeli invasion, ill-fated invasion of Beirut in 1982, the disastrous Israeli invasion. But nonetheless, that group, Hezbollah, has done a lot of things. It's done a lot of good, probably for Shia in southern Lebanon. It's part of the government of Lebanon, but a very disruptive force. But as an American, particularly a former official, I can't forget the murder of American citizens. And I won't forget it. Barbara.
I think because the question was asked by a Kuwaiti student of Americans, I'd like to relay a story or a question that I received from an Egyptian student a couple of years ago. And we were having a debate about whether nonviolence or violence is a better way to restore your rights in the international community. And you can imagine what side of that I was on. And the student asked me the question, do you think if the United States of America had even 2 square miles of its territory occupied for over 40 years, and no recourse from the international community, the United Nations, wars, nothing else has worked, do you not think that America would have resistance movements? And that those movements would probably resort to violence? And I think it's a really good question for us to keep thinking about.
Yes, right here. It's working now. Yeah.
Linda Patchett, Newcastle, New Hampshire. One, I have just incredible gratitude to the Camden Conference and the people that put it on, and to all these speakers. I am always left with so many more questions, which I think is what you're trying to do, but also a sense of hope, usually. Today, I stand before you because I left with a pit in my stomach yesterday afternoon. And it was the conversation between Hussein and Nick that created that pit in my stomach. Because I want to believe you both. And your stories were both compelling to me. And what I felt as a US citizen, but really I wanted to be a citizen of the world yesterday as I was listening to you. And I couldn't figure out where the facts were. And when I couldn't figure out the facts, I couldn't trust. And I think that's where we are today, is this sense of how do we create a sense of trust among us again, is so important to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is really a very bad situation between Iran and the US. This is because of mistrust. This is because of misunderstanding. This is because of miscalculations. This is because of misperceptions. I can tell you another 10 misses. But we should look forward. And confidence building is the only way. Understanding each other is the only way. I'm skeptical whether our governments would be able to have such a courageous mindset and brave decision to go forward for different measures for better understanding, for recognizing the past mistakes, and to open a new door. But the best way for the moment to be realistic, I believe, if President Obama can decide, is to open relation for people to people. I mean, if American government, Iranian government, they want to stay hostile together for another century, let them go. Why the people? Iranian nation, I agree with Ambassador Pope. I said yesterday, Iranian nation, they do not have hostility toward American nations. And Americans also, I believe they are the same. Of course, if they may have not a good understanding about Iran, but they have no problem with Iranian nations. I would like to propose to both governments to open the doors for the people-to-people relations. And perhaps a decade of a very comprehensive people-to-people relation, like tourism, like humanitarian relations, like academic relations, facilitating the visa, just people to people. Let the people, perhaps the people can change the course of hostilities.
So this is the first time that Hussein and I have agreed this weekend, and you brought us together. I very much agree with that. And neither government has committed itself to full citizen exchanges. There are barriers to visas on both sides, and I think this would be a very good first step. If governments can't find a way to communicate, citizen diplomacy, sometimes we call it track 2 diplomacy, sometimes can help. I would say what you saw yesterday, from my perspective, between Hussein and me, was real life. Yeah. Between these two countries and governments. And I imagine if we're successful in putting the two governments together in direct negotiations, not the kind of multilateral negotiations of tomorrow and the next day in Kazakhstan, which is going to happen with Russia, China, and the Europeans, but direct talks, the kind that Vice President Biden suggested 3 weeks ago. I think that the initial conversations will be a lot like what Hussein and I were sparring with yesterday. We both I think we're both very confident of our own facts, and we both have different narratives reflecting our two governments. He and I worked for two different governments for most of our adult lives. There's a huge chasm between these two historical narratives. And I'm sure that he is confident of his, I'm very confident of mine. So what has to happen? We have to bring people together to talk, because those negotiations could lead us away from war. So the sparring of yesterday is far preferable to a war. And so we got to get the two countries together, and people like the two of us together more often. Thank you. You're a natural diplomat. Yes, right here.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for that. I have a question for you, but I also want to make a suggestion that just came to me. Why not take the Camden Conference, this Camden Conference, to Cairo or Beirut or even Tehran? Wouldn't that be a good idea?
What do you say, panel? Are you ready to go off? We have a jet waiting at Portland Airport.
Next year.
That's right. I do have a question, however. My question, I detect an elephant in the room, and I've detected it throughout the conference, that has been alluded to but not really dealt with, and that's what I think is the hardest nut in the Middle East, and that's Palestine. And what I would like to ask the panel in general, and the organizers too, is Palestine not included directly because it has become irrelevant, or is it such a tough nut to crack that we might as well put it aside and deal with these other issues first?
You're right. It's absent, but look, this was a tough conference to put together. There's so many different issues. I think what happened in the Israeli elections on January 22nd, with a surprise vote, second-place vote for a moderate party dedicated to negotiations with the Palestinians, is going to force Prime Minister Netanyahu to think again. And maybe as Zippy Livni comes back as the negotiator, there's at least a glimmer of hope. And Secretary Kerry has been speaking a lot about his hope to reignite negotiations. Marwan is closer to this than anybody because he lives just across the river from both the Palestinians as well as the Israelis.
She lives close to me. I've spent most of my professional career in contributing to bringing peace between Arabs and Israelis. And I was the first ambassador of my country to Israel. I want to make two comments, one related to the Arab Palestine and the Arab awakening, and one related to the conflict itself. I think the United States is going to face an awfully difficult time in the Middle East if it is to regain even part of its credibility that has been lost before the Arab awakening. If it argues to the Arab publics today that if you're Egyptians or Tunisians or Libyans or Moroccans or Yemenis or Syrians yearning for freedom, we are with you. But if you're Palestinians yearning for freedom, it's complicated. That's not going to be an argument that will resonate anywhere in the Arab world, not just with Palestinians. On the conflict itself, I'm actually rather pessimistic. I'm pessimistic not because I don't believe a solution exists. I think it exists, and I think, you know, every Dick, Harry, and what?
Tom.
Oh, Tom. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry know what it is.
Every Muhammad, every
Muhammad
But I think the two sides have come to a situation where they are not able to sit together and put it together. And the United States, which is the only catalyst that can help the two sides come together, has decided that it is too difficult for this to be attempted, that the chances of success are very small, and that therefore it is better not attempted. I'm not optimistic, and I hope to God that I'm wrong. I'm not optimistic that the second Obama administration is going to make a serious effort at this. Because in my view, a serious effort is not to launch another process. That has lost all credibility in the Middle East. You cannot keep having two people arguing over a pizza while one of them is eating it. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. And no Arab, I can assure you, moderates before hardliners is interested in another process while the status quo is being changed every single day. Arabs today look at the Oslo process, at the Madrid process, and they see a 20-year-old process that has not resulted in a solution, but has resulted in the number of settlers increasing from 250,000 at the time that the Oslo agreements were signed in '93 to over 500,000 today. 200,000 of these are in East Jerusalem. 80,000 of these are in the heartland of the West Bank, not along the Green Line, not along the border between Israel and Palestine. Even if an agreement is signed today, implementing it in a way that would separate these two communities is almost impossible. And keeping them together, requires security measures that are a nightmare even to think of. If there is no two-state solution now, if there is no process that would lead to a solution in few months, not in few years, then I think that the window has closed. Many people would tell you it has already closed. Frankly, as an analyst, I will tell you it has closed. As an ex-diplomat, I'll tell you few months. But I am in, if you look at the situation, if you look at even with the new current coalition, Nick, of Mr. Netanyahu, I'm just not convinced that Mr. Netanyahu ideologically is prepared to make the necessary concessions that would create a viable Palestinian state. I'm not convinced, with Tzipi Livni or without her. So I'm afraid we're going to go into a period of no solution, frankly, no solution for quite some time, a decade or two, and then the Palestinians will start asking for the next logical thing, which is equal rights within the state they live in. Today, the number of Arabs and the number of Jews today is equal in areas under Israel's control. It's 6 million Jews and 6 million Arabs today. So this is not an issue that is going to be postponed for much longer, I'm afraid.
So we're out of time, but Mark, did you want the last word, 30 seconds?
No, I'd rather Marwan have it.
Okay. So I want to turn the podium over to our host, Bland Banwell, with an immense thanks to her and to the Camden Committee for this Citizens Diplomatic Conference. Thanks to all the organizers, all the ushers, Jim Ruddy, Jim Matlack, everybody behind this screen and up there with the audiovisual equipment. I wanted to thank every single one of these panelists. I learned from everybody. I learned from each presentation. I think all of you did too. And we can't just leave on a completely hopeless note. So whether we are Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, the Bible tells us, pray for the peace of Jerusalem in the Middle East.